So, welcome to you all once again to our Living Prayer podcast. With me here now is Father Matt Blake, who is at our priory in Kensington, London, and he has accepted to join us for the part of our series that reflects on prayer in the Carmelite tradition. And we will be looking towards scriptural figures that inspire Carmel's attitude and outlook to prayer, referring particularly to the persons of the prophet Elijah and Our Lady, and eventually we will also reflect on the inspiration that we can draw from the two mighty saints of Carmel, if we can use that expression, Saints Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. So Matt, welcome.
Thank you.
And so, just going straight right in light of the theme already highlighted, what can you say in response to the question about how the prophet Elijah inspires prayer for the Carmelites and generally for everyone who looks up to the Carmelite spiritual?
Well, from ancient times, Elijah has been referred to as the prophet of prayer. And the historic context of that comes about the particular time where he comes into the Bible. He comes in very much at a time when the prayer and worship of the people of Israel was in crisis or at a very low ebb. People had lost the sense of prayer, the sense of a right relationship with God. And Elijah in the Bible restores that worship of Israel, that right relationship with God. Some people would say he really saved the whole spirituality of the Bible, which was very much going off course at the time. That might be a bit exaggerated, but in that sense, he is the one who restores that right relationship with God. And so, many religious orders founded in the Middle Ages around the time the Carmelites looked to Elijah. He was very much the inspiration for much religious life and monastic life in the church. The Carmelites, of course, have a particular identification with Elijah because we began on Mount Carmel, and we're called after the mountain of Elijah, Mount Carmel. So we very much identify with that place associated with Elijah. Of course, it is much deeper than that, because the first Carmelites really saw their calling as a prophetic calling, a calling to bear witness. They were crusaders. The Europeans went to the land of the Bible with the Crusades, but with a very different motive to most others. Others were going to fight wars or to make money or for adventure. These first Carmelites saw themselves as bearing prophetic witness to the true meaning of the land of the Bible. What is this place really about? And so they settle on Mount Carmel. and they settle there in a place where there's already a very strong spiritual tradition. And they see themselves very much as the successors of Elijah. And Elijah on Mount Carmel, his particular link with Mount Carmel in the Bible is the famous contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And while the historic context is obviously very different to ours, the fundamentals remain the same. And the fundamental discussion taking place there is all around what a right relationship with God is. For Elijah is the prophet of a right relationship with God. And the first Carmelites saw themselves as prophets of that right relationship with God. People who've settled on Mount Carmel, not just to be there, but to enter into a relationship with God, to enter into a right relationship with God, a relationship rooted in the Bible, and a relationship that is life-giving, a relationship that is deep, that's profound. So they see themselves very much as the successors of Elijah, who stood on Mount Carmel, stood there before God, and proclaimed before all the prophets of Baal and before everyone who God is and how we relate with God. So I suppose that is, in a sense, the essence of Carmelite prayer, to know who God is and to relate with Him in a right way, in the way that the Bible sets out for us.
I think you put it very beautifully, speaking of Elijah as one who embodies for us zeal for the right relationship that one is to maintain with God, and how this relationship would inform the lives of those who take after his example. And indeed, one wonders how we can translate that ancient outlook of Elijah and eventually of the first Carmelites on Mount Carmel into the regular experience, the language of the regular experience of people today. I wonder if you could shed some more light on that.
When we read the Bible, read the first book of Kings, the stories about Elijah, one of the things that's striking about those stories is that there doesn't seem to be much connection between them. It's almost like Elijah simply appears there, and God says, do this, go there, I want you here, this event takes place, that happens. It's like a whole series of random events happen. It appears like that. Of course, that's not how it is. But we get that, so there isn't a coherent story. Rather, the person that we meet, Elijah, is simply open to God, open to the presence of God. Whatever God may do, whatever God may ask. And we see it time and time and again with Elijah. God says, go, do, say, whatever. And Elijah immediately responds. Whatever situation or circumstance he finds himself in, he is open to responding to God. God is here. God is speaking through this situation. And we see this, for example, when Elijah flees from Jezebel, flees for his life. She's threatening to kill him, and there he is in the desert, wants to die. God intervenes. Elijah struggles to respond. God has to intervene twice. But God intervenes and gives Elijah that strength to walk for 40 days and 40 nights. Of course, in the Bible, that's always symbolic. Whenever we hear of 40, that's a lifetime. Elijah is fed by God, given life by God. His whole life is nourished, nurtured by God. So God meets him there when he is at his lowest and gives him life. Elijah has this openness to responding to God. And so it is with us, wherever we are, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. God is here. God is saying something. God has some plan here. God is making his presence known here. Then when Elijah is on Mount Horeb in Sinai, the mountain of God as the Bible calls it, there again we find in Elijah this ability to recognize God, to hear God in the circumstances he's in. There's a fire, there's an earthquake, there's all of these events that are normally associated with God. In traditional religion, the strong elements like wind and fire and earthquake are associated with God and the manifestation of God. But Elijah is able to say no. Elijah is listening at a deeper level. Elijah isn't swept away by one thing or another. The storms of life don't sweep him away. He's able to hear God in silence. That deep, profound silence where Elijah can hear God, where God can make himself known to Elijah. So perhaps there is the message for us then. Whatever the storms of our lives may be, whatever the noise may be, whatever the big events may be, it is in the silence of our hearts, of our minds, of our deepest being that God will be heard. And he always is. He speaks to us in the depths. And none of these other things can keep that away, can silence the voice of God. So there, I think somewhere there, Elijah, this person who can hear God in the midst of whatever is happening and can respond to God wherever God may speak, in whatever way that God may call. And so it is not in the external, for Elijah, it is not in the external circumstances, but in that deeper voice of God. The external circumstances are almost incidental, but that deeper voice of God that Elijah can hear and can respond to.
Thank you for that answer. The story of Elijah is actually quite intriguing. You mentioned about the main event that brought Elijah's prophetic fame to prominence as his battle with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And many persons have pointed out that even in the challenge that Elijah made to the prophets of Baal to call on their gods, to bring about fire to consume their offering, and he will do the same, that it was not until Elijah particularly uttered the words in speaking with God, that for the sake of your glory, O Lord, may this oblation be consumed. And prior to that, much of what was at play was Elijah's ego. Whether that was the case or not, we do not know. What we can say, however, is okay, there are human interferences with how God is inviting each person into right relationship with himself. In what ways can we say that Elijah's human shortcomings interfered with that sense of relationship that he had with God? Eventually, after the battle with the prophets of Baal, where the prophets were slain, and Elijah flees Carmel, this place he's greatly associated with, and he goes to a new place where he encounters God in a new way, in, as some people will put it, in the unexpected. How can we think of the prophets of Baal in our experience of prayer understood as walking towards that right relationship with God and bearing witness to that? What can we say of that? And what does the story of Elijah's journey through the desert, from Carmel to Horeb, to a new place, what does it say to people today?
I suppose I would start at the very end of that long story when Elijah comes before God on Mount Horeb and said, I alone am left. Elijah's a lonely figure. He seems to be alone all the time. There are 300 prophets of Baal, he's alone. How any of us can face 300? 1 versus 300. And again, 88, he's alone. Elijah seems to be always alone. And there can be two sides to that aloneness. One is the one of weakness, of isolation, and he senses that and feels that. And why do I have to face all of these, and why do I have to do this? But the aloneness is also that something that makes him rely totally upon God. Because there's nothing else he can rely on. Everything else is gone. There's nothing else to rely upon. And the prophets of Baal symbolically represent what takes us off course, what takes us down wrong roads. They obviously are powerful. They have strength. They have, in the eyes of the world, success. There's a lot more of them. There's all these hundreds of you. There's only me, as Elijah says. So they represent. what in the eyes of the world is attractive and powerful. But they also represent what is subtly deceiving, because they appear to have got it right. They appear to be victorious. They appear to have the answers. But in reality, it's a facade. And what Elijah exposes is their weakness. And therefore, his totally dependence upon God makes him victorious over them. But of course, that victory is a victory. How would I put this? Not one at a human level. Elijah doesn't feel victorious or feel strong afterwards. One little threat from Jezebel and he's gone. After this great encounter with God, this great experience of God, what Elijah himself actually is left with is his own weakness, his own vulnerability. In worldly terms, we'd have expected Elijah to be a hero, to be triumphant after that victory on Mount Carmel. In reality, he feels his own weakness. He feels his own vulnerability. And therefore Jezebel is able to threaten him. Why should she be, if he is victorious over all these prophets, why should she be such a threat? But she is. And therefore it's his own vulnerability, his own weakness that takes over. And so off he goes to Beersheba, leaves his servant there and goes a day into the desert. And of course, those of you familiar with the desert and that part of the world knows that Beersheba is the furthest south that settled people can live. Apart from the Bedouins and desert people, there just isn't enough water south of Beersheba. So going a day into the desert means that he's going there to die. He knows he can't survive there. There's no way of surviving. So he's taking his own life. That deep encounter with weakness. And again, it is in that very weakness, that lowest place, that God intervenes. God comes in once more. The power of God that was displayed on Mount Carmel in a very visible way, in victory over all those prophets, is a power of God that now intervenes in a much more personal way. That moment of greatest weakness and vulnerability is that moment when God intervenes. Once more he meets God. Meets God in his most weakest place. And as you've rightly said, this carries him into a deeper place in his relationship with God. But ultimately then, jumping forward in the story, the end of the story, Elijah said right back to the place that he ran away from. Go back and tell Ahab, the king, Jezebel's husband. Go back and confront him. So Elijah isn't left in peace in the end. Elijah's journey takes him right back to facing the king and the queen that he has ran away from. Sends him right back into the midst of the political situation of his time. Sends him right back to confront injustice and oppression. So all this experience of God that he has, all of this encounters with God, are there to give him the strength and the courage to go back and to fulfill the next part of the mission that God gives him, which for Elijah would be the most challenging of all. And again, he has to rely not on any ability he has himself or any knowledge that he has himself, but solely upon God. God will give him what he needs. And it is only now that Elijah really has the courage and the insight to say yes to whatever it is God may be asking. The last place he would ever have chosen, or indeed have expected to be asked to do, is to go back again to confront that political situation that he has already had to confront, knowing that he's seen as the enemy. So in the unexpected turns and twists, there God reveals himself. And of course, if we go back to the original Carmelites, that's what's going to happen to them also. Mount Carmel, which was so essential to them, their whole identity coming from Mount Carmel and the prophet Elijah, they, of course, will have to leave Mount Carmel. They will have to return to the countries that they came from. They will have to go back to lives that they took a decision years earlier to leave. In a sense, the experience of the early Carmelites in some way mirrors that experience of Elijah being sent back to confront Ahab. The Carmelites are sent back to the cities and towns and countries of Europe to live the life that had began on Mount Carmel, but now to live in the same spirit of Mount Carmel, but in a very different way. So Elijah's experience and the experience of the first Carmelites in some way mirror each other. When we say yes to God, we do not know where or what that is going to entail. But what we can be sure of is that it will mean surprise. It will not be as we foresee it to be. It will take us into very challenging situations. But like Elijah and the first Carmelites, our strength is not in ourselves, but in the presence of God and the power of God. And often 'tis when things work out very unexpectedly, we find ourselves weak and vulnerable, that God's hand is seen and God's hand is most powerful.
Thank you for that. Indeed, I think the story of Elijah speaks to everyone who, in some form or another, would have false gods and idols that they would have to conquer if they are to allow the glory of God hold sway in their experience and in their relationship with God. It would certainly entail traveling to this new place of encounter, where they encounter God speaking to them. But on a final note, when Elijah arrives at this new place in Horeb and is able to identify God's presence in a new way, God puts a very important question to Elijah and asks, "What are you doing here?" And perhaps, maybe that is a question that God asks to each person who comes to Him in prayer, running or fleeing away from everything that has posed a threat to maintaining that right relationship. Are there any insights that you would like to share about the importance of that question and being able to identify when God is asking the same of us?
I suppose the first thing to remember is when God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here?" Where is here? Here is on Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, the most holy place in the Bible, the place where God spoke with Moses, came face to face with Moses. So God is asking Elijah, what are you doing standing in the place of the Word of God? We might say standing in the very heart of the Bible, the Word of God. That's where he is. Elijah's mind was probably on many other things, the fire and the earthquake and everything like that that's going on and all the turmoil going on and what he has ran away from and why he is here. There may be 1,001 things going through Elijah's mind. But that question roots Elijah found right where he is. You're in the midst of the experience of God, the revelation of God in the scriptures. You are standing in the place where Moses stood face to face with God. You are standing before God. And that's what God is asking Elijah. And when that question comes into our minds, when we hear that question in some way or other in our minds and in our hearts, that too is our answer. Most of the time it's not the answer that will come into our heads, but it is the real answer. Because that's where we always are. We are always before the face of God. We are always in God's presence. God is always speaking to us. Everywhere is the mountain of God. Everywhere is Mount Horeb. Everywhere is the Bible. Is a holy place. Is holy ground. We're standing on holy ground. So Elijah that day is standing on holy ground. And God is speaking to him. But not in isolation. It's the Bible. It's the Word of God. Moses is there. The whole Bible is there. It is the Word of God coming to him. So that is where we are. That is where we always are. And as you rightly said, it's a very good question. It's a question that is there in all our minds and hearts. But the answer is always going to be the same. We are always before the face of God. We are always there, looking up to him, and he looking down on us.
Thank you, Matt. That about wraps up our section on Elijah, the prophet, and I believe we can take away from all you have said the conviction that we are always standing before God, and our disposition should be such that we look to God, and as such are able to pray wherever we are, because God is present there. Thank you once again, Matt.
Sure.
And thank you. See you in our next reflection.